There's a moment in every young quarterback's career where the noise gets so loud it becomes almost impossible to separate what's real from what's just being repeated until it feels real. For Shedeur Sanders, that moment isn't coming, it's already here. And in the next few days, one football game against one of the most physically imposing defenses in the entire league is going to do more to answer the questions swirling around this kid than 3 months of training camp practices, film sessions, and media hot takes ever could. But before we get to Sunday, there are 2 stories that dropped this week that deserve a serious look, because both of them, when you actually dig into what's happening beneath the surface, tell you something important about where this Browns team is right now and what they're actually building around their young quarterback. One is a roster move that most people glossed over. The other is a film breakdown that completely reframes one of the most talked about plays of this entire camp. And when you put them together, the picture looks a lot different than what you've been hearing from the loudest voices in Cleveland media. Let's get into it. On the surface, the Browns signing tight end Germaine Terry II looks like exactly the kind of low-profile August transaction that gets buried under every other piece of news this time of year. A body in, a body out. Brendan Bates gets released on an injury settlement. Terry gets a camp deal. Roster churns forward. Easy to scroll past, easy to file under depth move, nothing to see here. But context matters, and the context around this specific move at this specific moment is worth slowing down for. Terry isn't some random name pulled off a list. He was originally brought into the league by the Giants as an undrafted free agent out of Oregon State. He didn't stick there either, also let go on an injury settlement, which puts him in a category of player that gets overlooked constantly in these kinds of roster discussions. The injury settlement path gets treated like a red flag by default, like it automatically means a player isn't good enough or isn't healthy enough to contribute. But that's a massively oversimplified read on how the NFL's roster construction actually works at the tight end position specifically. Tight end is one of the most difficult positional fits in the entire league. You need size, you need blocking ability, you need reliable hands, and you need the football IQ to run a route tree that's genuinely complex compared to what most people realize from the outside. Finding all of those things in the same player at the right price point is hard. Finding them in an undrafted free agent is even harder. So what teams do, constantly, especially in August, is cycle through multiple bodies at the position looking for the combination that fits their specific scheme. A player bouncing from one roster to another on injury settlements doesn't automatically mean he's a bust. Sometimes it just means he hasn't found the right system yet. The Giants' offense and the Browns' offense are very different animals. What didn't fit there might fit perfectly here. What matters most about this particular signing is the timing. The Browns didn't add Terry in June. They didn't add him in the first week of camp when the roster was still being assembled from scratch. They tried him out last week, liked what they saw, and brought him in right now, days before Shedeur Sanders is scheduled to take his first career snap as a starting quarterback against a Buffalo Bills defense that is going to come after him with everything they have. That is not a coincidence. Coaching staffs don't make roster additions this close to a season opener without a specific reason in mind. You don't absorb the administrative work, the onboarding, the playbook installation, the chemistry building with a new player unless you believe that player fills a specific gap that matters immediately. And what Terry brings, based on every account coming out of Cleveland, is exactly the kind of physicality and catch radius that becomes invaluable for a young quarterback making his debut against a team with real preparation time to scheme against him. A big-bodied tight end who can win contested catches gives a first-time starter something incredibly valuable. It gives him an answer. When the pocket collapses, when the coverage is tighter than expected, when the designed play breaks down before it's supposed to, a quarterback who knows he has a large, physical target underneath who can go up and make a play in traffic doesn't have to force the issue downfield. He can check it down, take the yards that are there, live to see the next play. That's not a crutch, that's smart football. And it's exactly the kind of intelligence the Browns coaching staff is demonstrating by making this move when they made it. So yes, Germaine Terry II signing with Cleveland is a depth move on paper, but it's a depth move timed with precision, and the message it sends about how this organization is thinking about Shedeur's debut is louder than anything that got said in any press conference this week. Now, here's where things get interesting, because while the roster move flew mostly under the radar, another story has been absolutely dominating the Browns' conversation for the last several days, and it starts with one throw. Shedeur Sanders dropped back, released the ball, and it sailed. Badly. The kind of miss that makes you wince when you watch it in real time, because there's no obvious explanation for it in the moment. The receiver wasn't in traffic, the coverage didn't close faster than expected, it just went nowhere where it was supposed to go. And the reaction online was immediate and brutal. Comment sections flooded with takes about decision-making, about arm accuracy, about whether this kid was actually ready. The clip got shared hundreds of times across every major Browns fan account and every NFL media platform with any kind of reach. And on a surface level, the frustration made sense. You watch a throw sail that far off target from your quarterback, you want answers. You want to know if it's a fluke or if it's something more concerning. But then, something happened that completely changed the conversation. Former NFL quarterback Chase Daniel did something that almost nobody in the broader media coverage actually bothered to do. He went back and watched the play, not once, not twice. He watched it approximately 30 times, frame by frame. And what he found buried in the footage is the kind of detail that a casual viewing, even a careful one, almost certainly wouldn't catch. Right before Shedeur releases the ball, the football visibly flips and rotates in his hand, not once, twice mid-drop, while he's already committed to the throw. If you don't play quarterback at a high level, that detail might seem minor, like something you'd only notice if you were looking for it. But Chase Daniel isn't a casual observer. He played quarterback in the NFL for over a decade. He's seen this exact thing happen up close. And he explained with real precision why that visible ball manipulation is such a significant tell. When a quarterback adjusts the ball in his hand during his drop, it almost always means one thing: the grip doesn't feel right. And the most common reason a grip doesn't feel right late in the game when a center has been out there snapping for 3 or 4 quarters in August heat is moisture. Sweat transfers from a center's hands onto the football with every single snap. And if that moisture lands in a specific spot, particularly where a quarterback's throwing thumb needs traction to generate proper spin, it doesn't matter how clean the rest of the ball is, that one wet patch is enough to completely disrupt the spiral. Daniel's explanation wasn't vague or general. He pointed to the specific visual evidence on the tape, the ball spinning twice in Shedeur's hand, and connected it directly to a physical cause. He also noted that what Shedeur did in response was actually impressive from a pure quarterback instinct standpoint. He recognized the grip issue in real time, tried to adjust for it mid-drop, attempted to find a cleaner surface to release from. That's not something a quarterback does by accident. That's not panic. That's a player who has enough feel for the position to recognize a problem and try to solve it in a fraction of a second under live game pressure. The problem is that sometimes the physics just don't cooperate. Even with the adjustment, if the moisture hit his thumb at the release point, there's almost nothing he could have done to save the throw. The ball was already compromised, and a compromised football doesn't care how clean your mechanics are or how correct your read was. It goes where it goes. Daniel's conclusion was direct. A miss that far off its intended target doesn't usually come from a clean, dry ball and a clean decision. Something was affecting the throw, and a slick ball from center sweat, especially working with the second-team unit in a preseason environment where equipment attention to detail doesn't always match what starting units get, was his read on what that something actually was. Here's the thing about this particular explanation that keeps getting glossed over in the social media version of this conversation. It isn't speculation. It isn't a fan account manufacturing an excuse. It's grounded in the actual physics of how a football works and why grip conditions matter so much more than casual fans typically account for. A regulation NFL football has a very specific leather texture, engineered precisely so that quarterbacks can generate consistent spin and grip pressure on every throw. The moment any part of that surface becomes slick, from rain, from sweat, from just the natural wear and moisture that builds up over the course of a game, the physics of every throw change. The same mechanics that produce a perfect spiral on a dry ball can produce a duck on a wet one. And crucially, the change isn't always dramatic enough for the quarterback to realize it's happening until it's too late. This is exactly why you see teams carry towels on the sideline, why you see centers wipe the ball between snaps in bad weather games, why some of the best deep ball throwers in league history have talked openly about grip feel as one of the first things that deteriorates when conditions get difficult. The attention to this kind of detail is a staple of how NFL teams manage the physical side of the game at the highest level. But preseason camp is not the highest level of operational detail, especially not for a second team unit. Equipment protocols that get executed perfectly for the starting group, fresh ball rotation, towel availability, center reminders to wipe down, sometimes slip through the cracks when you drop down to the second and third units. That's not incompetence, it's just the reality of how the roster and practice hierarchy operates in August. And when those small details slip, you can end up with exactly the kind of isolated bad throw we're talking about here. Not because the quarterback made a bad decision, not because he can't make that throw, but because the ball he was working with had already been compromised. There's also a broader point worth making here about how film evidence gets weighted differently depending on who's doing the talking. Chase Daniel isn't a Twitter account with an agenda. He isn't a fan channel trying to protect a favorite player. He's a former professional quarterback who played in this league long enough to have felt exactly what a slick ball does to a release. When someone with that background goes back and watches a play 30 times and points to specific visual evidence on the tape as the basis for his conclusion, that deserves to be taken seriously, not dismissed because it's inconvenient for a narrative that was already forming before anyone bothered to look closer. Not everyone sees it that way, and that's putting it mildly. Local Cleveland media has been running hot on this story, and one particular host went on a segment recently that's worth dissecting in detail because it's more complicated than it looks at first glance. The frustration in his take was real, and it was pointed. He said, and he wasn't subtle about it, that he's exhausted trying to figure out what the next explanation is going to be every time Shedeur has a rough moment. First, it was pressure and tough circumstances, then it was a wet ball. He went full sarcasm with it, joking about what wild environmental factor or external conspiracy might get offered up next time something goes wrong. The underlying message was clear. He thinks the pattern of contextualizing every single Shedeur mistake has gone beyond fair analysis and crossed into excuse-making territory.
And look, that frustration isn't coming from nowhere. When every rough play has a detailed explanation attached to it, it can start to feel like the explanation is the point, rather than the performance. That's a legitimate concern worth taking seriously. Accountability matters. Film analysis that always seems to land on, but here's why it wasn't really his fault, can become its own kind of bias if you're not careful about it. But here's where the same segment gets genuinely interesting, because after all of that, after the sarcasm and the frustration and the exhaustion he described, this same host made a confession that deserved a lot more attention than it got. He said he personally never wanted the Browns to trade for Deshaun Watson. He never wanted Watson to be the starter. He doesn't want Watson to be the starter now. But he said he has to be honest about what he's actually watching on the field, regardless of what he personally wants. And his honest take was that one quarterback has simply looked better than the other two through this stretch. There's real intellectual honesty in that, more than you typically get from media coverage of any team during any quarterback competition. Admitting that your own rooting interest and your analytical conclusion are pointing in different directions is the kind of self-awareness that a lot of commentators don't bother with. He got credit for that. But here's the tension that his own segment created and never fully resolved. He's calling out excuse-making as a pattern. He's saying it's intellectually exhausting to keep contextualizing every mistake, and then he turns around and makes a broad claim one quarterback has clearly played better off a sample size that includes exactly the kind of play where a credible, evidence-based, film-grounded explanation exists and was laid out in detail by a former NFL player who watched the tape 30 times. You can't have it both ways. You can't call for less excuse-making in one breath and then in the next breath make a definitive verdict call while completely flattening the context that a credible analyst just provided. That's not consistency. That's just choosing which evidence to count and which evidence to dismiss based on which direction it pushes the narrative. There's a pattern in how young or unproven quarterbacks get covered in this league, and it's been operating in the background of this entire Shedeur Sanders conversation from the moment he entered camp. The pattern is what you could call an interpretation penalty, and once you see it, you genuinely cannot unsee it. When an established veteran quarterback throws an interception, the default framing is almost always charitable. It was a miscommunication. The receiver ran the wrong route. The defense disguised their coverage well. Bad luck, happens to everyone, move on. That interception gets folded into the broader understanding that even great quarterbacks throw picks sometimes, and one bad play doesn't define a player's ability or ceiling. When a rookie throws that exact same interception, it becomes a referendum, not just on that throw, not just on that possession, but on whether he's actually ready, whether his arm talent is real, whether his decision-making under pressure can be trusted. The same physical event gets interpreted through two completely different lenses based on the player's status, and both of those lenses cannot be right at the same time. The fair approach, the intellectually honest approach, is to apply the same level of scrutiny in both directions. If you're going to contextualize a veteran's mistake, you need to contextualize a rookie's mistake with the same generosity. And if you're going to hold a rookie strictly accountable for every turnover without context, you have to apply that same strict accounting to every quarterback, regardless of experience or contract size. Picking and choosing which plays get context and which plays get treated as character indictments based on who threw the ball isn't analysis, it's bias wearing the costume of analysis. The media incentive structure makes this pattern worse, not better. Simple narratives travel faster than complicated ones in this business. Shedeur isn't ready is a clean take. It fits in a headline, it generates engagement, it gives people something to argue about in comment sections. Shedeur's bad throw might have been caused by a moisture issue that a former NFL quarterback identified through frame-by-frame film analysis is a much harder thing to turn into viral content. The incentive is always toward the simpler story, even when the simpler story is missing most of what actually happened. And the honest part of this is that nobody is immune to that incentive. Not the host who went on the segment, not the fan accounts sharing the clip, not this channel either. The pull toward a clean story is always there, which is exactly why the response to that pull has to be deliberate. You have to actively choose to apply consistent standards even when inconsistency would be easier and generate more clicks.
There's one more piece of this conversation that keeps getting skipped over, and it might be the most important one from a pure analytical standpoint. When a media host says one quarterback has clearly played better than the other two, the natural follow-up question is, over what exact window? Under what exact conditions? Camp practices against your own defense where everyone knows everyone's tendencies? Joint practices where the preparation time and scheme complexity are nothing like a real game week? One preseason half here, a quarter there, a single competitive series that happened to go well or badly? None of that, even all of it added together, comes close to a real evaluation sample yet. The math just doesn't work. If you flipped a coin 10 times and it came up heads 7 times, you would not conclude that the coin was rigged. You'd want many more flips before you drew any real conclusion about what the coin actually does, because 10 flips isn't enough data. The variance in a sample that small can produce misleading results even with a perfectly fair coin. Quarterback evaluation isn't a coin flip. There's real skill involved. There's real signal in what gets displayed, even in camp reps and preseason snaps. But the sample is still small enough that treating any single stretch as a definitive verdict, especially when part of that stretch includes a play with a specific physical explanation attached to it, is premature. It might feel satisfying to reach a conclusion, it might generate good content to declare a winner, but premature conclusions in quarterback evaluations have a long and painful history of being wrong in ways that cost franchises years of momentum. The Browns coaching staff clearly understands this, which is why the competition is still open enough to debate, and why Shedeur is still getting his shot at a first career start, despite the narrative pressure from outside. Coaches who actually have to live with the consequences of getting this wrong tend to be more patient than media members who can just move on to the next story if the take doesn't land. Everything this camp has been building toward comes down to one game, one opponent, one real set of reps against a defense that has had an entire week to scheme specifically against Shedeur Sanders, study his tendencies from the available film, design coverage looks and pressure packages targeted at what they identified as his weaknesses. That is a fundamentally different test than anything that has happened in camp or preseason to this point. And the results of that test are going to be worth more analytically than every practice report, every depth chart update, and every media segment combined. What does a genuinely good debut look like for Shedeur in this spot? Not perfection. Nobody should be expecting perfection from a quarterback making his first career start against a legitimate opponent. That's not a realistic bar, and it's not a fair one. What matters is the decision-making process. Are the reads getting made quickly enough under real defensive pressure? Is ball security being maintained even when the pocket isn't clean? Are checkdowns being taken when they're available instead of forcing throws into coverage? Are shots being taken when the defense actually gives them without hesitation? If Shedeur can put together that kind of profile, even with a pick or two in the mix, that tells us something genuinely important about his readiness. Not because the box score is clean, but because the process behind the plays is sound. A quarterback who makes the right decision under pressure but has the throw break down for physical reasons, like a compromised grip, is a completely different prospect than one who makes the wrong decision and throws it into coverage with the perfect ball. The outcome might look the same on the stat sheet. The implication for the future is completely different. The addition of Germaine Terry II matters specifically in this context. A physical tight end who can win in contested situations gives Shedeur a built-in answer on the downs where the decision has to be clean and fast. Red zone possession, third and medium, 2-minute drill possession where the coverage is tighter and the windows are smaller. In all of those situations, a big-bodied target with a wide catch radius takes some of the precision pressure off a quarterback who's still learning what a real game-speed read feels like against a defense that's actually trying to stop him.
Coordinators have been pairing young quarterbacks with exactly this kind of security blanket for decades because it works. It doesn't simplify the game to the point of removing challenge. It just removes one category of mistake, the forced throw into a tight window, by giving the quarterback a reliable outlet that doesn't require surgical accuracy to be effective. That's not a crutch, that's scheme intelligence. And the Browns adding Terry right before this specific start is exactly the kind of detail that signals this staff is serious about setting Shedeur up with every possible tool before he takes his first real snap. Zoom out far enough from this specific camp, this specific interception, this specific media segment, and what you're actually watching is the first chapter of a quarterback story that has barely started being written. Debut starts for young quarterbacks in this league go every possible direction. Some become signature moments that get replayed for decades. Some are humbling afternoons that look rough in the moment, but end up being exactly the kind of learning experience that makes everything that comes after it possible. There is no single script for what Sunday looks like. There is no version of this where one game settles the conversation permanently in either direction. Shedeur Sanders having a strong debut against Buffalo doesn't mean every question about his ceiling gets answered. Shedeur Sanders having a rough debut doesn't mean the ceiling isn't there. What it means is that the sample size starts getting real. The evaluation window starts including actual game reps against actual game preparation. The decisions he makes under actual pressure from a defense that didn't see him in practice all week start telling us things that 3 months of camp never could. The teams that build something sustainable at quarterback are the ones that resist the pressure to reach premature conclusions. They separate the noise from the signal week after week. They apply the same level of scrutiny to the good plays as they do to the bad ones. They don't let one perfect drive convince them a player's finished developing, and they don't let one brutal stretch convince them a player isn't worth developing. They stay in the process long enough to actually find out what they have. That same discipline is what honest quarterback coverage looks like from the outside. Give the wet ball explanation the same weight you'd give any other evidence-based analysis from a credible source. Hold the "one guy has clearly played better" take to the same evidentiary standard you'd hold any other definitive claim. Don't let the fatigue of a long camp stretch push you toward a verdict before the actual verdict has enough data to stand on. Sunday against Buffalo is Chapter 1 of the real book on Shedeur Sanders as an NFL starting quarterback. Everything before it was prologue, and the prologue, even the parts that looked bad on a highlight clip, might look very different once there are enough chapters to read it in full context. One thing is certain: whatever happens in that game, it deserves to be evaluated honestly, not through the lens of what people hoped would happen, not through the lens of what the most convenient narrative requires, just honestly, with the same rigor and the same openness to context that every play and every quarterback deserves, regardless of the name on the back of the jersey and regardless of how many takes have already been published about what the outcome is supposed to mean. That's the only standard worth applying, and Sunday is finally going to give us something real to apply it to. Drop your honest take in the comments. Do you buy Chase Daniel's film breakdown, or is a bad throw no matter the explanation? And what are your expectations for Shedeur's first career start against Buffalo? Let's get into it.